we're scoring about 5% in our test of what's the universe made of.
The Bible describes the real world as we know it. It has the ring of truth.
What kind of country is it that we live in when you can't tell a child why his father was killed because you didn't want him to grow up hating white people?
Does the human race deserve to continue?
From the Centre for Public Christianity, you're listening to Life and Faith. I'm Justine Toe. Where do you belong? Where do you fit? These are live questions for any of us to ask today, but especially for those who've come from across the seas. And that's at least 1 in 3 of us. Australia is the true nation of immigrants. Our guest today, Max Jeganathan, has spent some time musing about questions of belonging and identity because he's lived them. It's no exaggeration to say that he's a minority of a minority of a minority, and his experience of being an outsider or on the fringes of the mainstream has given him a unique take on how to negotiate belonging in an increasingly diverse world. We started with his own story and how he first came to call Australia home.
Yeah, so I was born in Sri Lanka, but came to Australia as a refugee with my parents. There's a civil war in Sri Lanka and we were effectively thrown out of the country, if you like, in the mid-'80s. I was just 1 year old, so I only know life in Australia from my childhood. And I can speak for not just my parents, but all of my relatives. And being a Sri Lankan, I have about 1 million cousins, about 2 million second cousins. And thankfully, we all managed to get out and escape the civil war when our lives were threatened and so forth. So my cousins and my family have all experienced a very similar cultural journey, I think, but they've done so in different countries. A lot of us in Australia, quite a lot in Canada, quite a lot in the United Kingdom, and a lot in America too. So we're kind of spread across. But getting here as kind of a first-generation, second-generation immigrant community, or refugee community, it really was, for my cousins and I, growing up, we really were straddling kind of both sides of these cultural divides, if you like.
Well, take us back to your experience, Max, as a teenager, raging hormones. You've got expectations from your parents. You're in a culture that's very different to what you're used to, I suppose, in terms of your family. How do you negotiate that? And how do you feel like, is it too much to say that you felt like an outsider?
I think certainly at times I felt like an outsider. I was very, very fortunate, I think, and very blessed that my parents were just fantastic in the way that they understood the cultural challenges that I was facing. And so while I think that, the whole the Asian tiger parent thing, it's a bit of a cliche, but it very much holds true. And certainly the Tamil culture, where I'm from, is very much a tiger parenting culture where children are driven very, very hard to succeed academically. The nature of success is very much measured by grades and the university you get into and the kind of profession that you're in. I have, 23 first cousins and I think around a dozen of them are doctors. Right. I was kind of the loser that became a lawyer. But that drive was certainly there. But my parents were just incredible in not piling on the pressure. So they did, I think, have expectations for me and hopes for me, and they did motivate me to work hard, but they were incredibly kind and gracious and loving and forgiving. So I never felt pressure as such to perform, while I did feel motivation to perform. And so I think I had that, which a lot of my Anglo-Australian friends might not have had as much as I did, that sense of expectation and motivation. I'm sure they had it in some part. But it allowed me then to kind of have one foot in each camp and to do so quite happily. And so I got to enjoy everything that kind of non-Eastern Australian culture had for me. And so I did a lot of things in terms of my interests in music and in surfing and in playing sports and in spending time with friends and building strong social networks, which is far more a Western thing than an Eastern thing. In the East, it's very much about our families, and it almost begins and ends with our families. And friends are just a little bit of garnish. Whereas in the West, certainly in the Anglo-West, friendship groups are incredibly important. In some cases, almost equally as important as family groups are. So growing up was really me and my cousins and friends from outside of Australia trying to negotiate that, trying to bring those different things together. And so that's always a challenge. But I think, as is the case with anyone everywhere, regardless of where you're born or where you grow up, you're really just trying to find a sense of belonging. You're trying to find your tribes, whether they're political tribes, cultural tribes, social tribes, professional tribes, familial tribes. We were just looking for belonging like anyone else was.
Max is the first to concede that as the refugee experience goes, he had a much easier time than others. With that supportive family environment, he went on to study law and political science at ANU, and then theology and philosophy at Oxford. In between his degrees, though, Max found himself working in politics.
My first job in politics was with a minister for the then federal government, Jenny Macklin. She was the Minister for Families, Housing, Community Services and Indigenous Affairs. She gave me my opportunity. She's been, since that day, a long-time mentor and very close friend of mine, whom I love very dearly. And so I worked for her for 6 years while she was a minister in government. And then I worked for just under 2 years for the Leader of the Opposition, who's the current Leader of the Opposition, Bill. I worked for Bill for 18 months after that. But my time as a policy advisor in government, that was all in Jenny's office.
Can you give us a sense of what being a policy advisor involves? What are you actually doing?
Sure. I think being a good policy advisor is being very much a part of the minister's or the Prime Minister's inner circle, the person for whom you're working. I think to do it well, you need to be willing to take a bullet for them. And certainly in my experience with Jenny's office, it helps a lot if they're willing to take a bullet for you too. And so that personal connection that I think good advisors have with their members of parliament that they work for is very, very important. It brings that common thread of endeavour down to a very personal level. So I don't believe that professional distance works in politics. I think you need to be completely emotionally and intellectually invested. So that was part of it. But then at the same time, while you're building that personal connection, and in so doing, you're aligning your understanding and your vision for what you believe is best for the country with their understanding and their vision. So I think for it to work well, you have to share the vision too, which is why I don't think it's like being a good doctor or a surgeon or an accountant where you can take your skill set and apply it in any place. I think the person for whom you're working, you really have to share their vision for Australia, in a national context anyway, which is what I was in. So there's that part of it, but you also have to be willing, I think, to speak truth to power, to be upfront and honest when you disagree with them, because there's always going to be differences of views and disagreements. And so, like with any job, success as a policy advisor is really about learning to get the instincts right between that moment of humility and that moment of kind of when you use your wherewithal to actually step out and say something that people will disagree with and then argue for that potentially. So the nature of the job, I had a lot of fun doing it. You get to speak to experts. You're constantly working with third-party stakeholders, with not just professional groups but lobby groups and various organisations representing the interests of all kinds of people. And so it was a really great kind of window for me, having lived in Australia my whole life. That 6 years working in government as a policy advisor for a minister was an unprecedented insight into Australia. And into all of our challenges, all of the good things and tough things about this country and all of the people working up there so hard to try and make it a better place from all sides of politics. And that's probably the last thing I'd say about it, is that one of the biggest revelations of being up there was seeing how many hardworking people are up there on every single side of politics, just getting up at crazy o'clock every morning, doing everything they can to try and make the country a better place. And yes, obviously, there's egos involved and there's self-drive involved and there's power and there's the internal brokenness of people and corruption of people. But on the whole, we should be pretty proud and pleased of our political system, which sadly isn't something we seem to be particularly pleased with at the moment.
Of course, this interview was recorded before Malcolm Turnbull lost the Prime Ministership, so Max may feel a little differently today. We'll have to ask him next time he's back in the country. These days, Max works for a non-profit Christian organisation called Ravi Zacharias International Ministries.
We have two missions, two very basic objectives. One is to help the thinker believe, and the other is to help the believer think. So we're Christians. Some of us are theologians and pastors or former pastors, but the majority of us come from cross-disciplinary backgrounds like myself. So the majority of us are either lawyers or philosophers or economists or supermodels. We have a supermodel on our speaking team. She never has a problem getting people to her events. But we kind of come from every discipline. We're all followers of Jesus, but because we believe the Christian message and the gospel of Jesus to be true, we believe it can stand up to questioning. And we think it's perfectly sensible and reasonable for people to have questions about the Christian faith. In fact, we think they should, both Christians and non-Christians. And so what we try and do is we're a group of speakers that travel globally, speaking at churches sometimes, but also speaking to government agencies, to businesses, into academia, into the arts community, and basically just helping people with their questions about Jesus, whatever they believe, whether they're Christians or not.
Were you a Christian at the time that you were working as a policy advisor?
I was. I've been a Christian since I was 15 years old.
Is being a Christian in a Tamil community quite a marginal status to have? Because from what I understand, Christianity is something like 7% of the Sri Lankan kind of religious landscape.
Absolutely. So I'm in a minority of minorities.
That's what I was basically trying to say.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So the majority of Sri Lankans are Buddhist. The minority are Hindus. And the Tamils are in the minority and they're Hindu. So I'm a Tamil. So I'm in an ethnic minority in that regard. But even within the Tamil minority, the Christian grouping there is even smaller again.
Yeah.
And so to be a Tamil Christian in itself is a minority. But then you take that and transplant that as a refugee community into a country like Australia. The Tamil Christian community in Australia is kind of even more proportionally smaller again.
Yeah.
We're obviously very active and we're very loud and we have churches and we're kind of everywhere now. But it is a minority of minorities. And then to go into politics, to go into professional politics from that group is then again a very, very small minority. I hope this changes over time, but Australia is just not at that place where immigrants and refugees from the East have been completely integrated into public life in the way that I think and I hope will happen over time. As you see in America, when you look at the judges, the benches of the court, the cabinets, and the governments around America, it's a lot more multicultural than it is in Australia just yet.
So meaning when you're looking around at your colleagues, you're not seeing other people who look like you?
Not that many. Not that many. We were definitely in a minority up there. There were a couple of us up there, but we were certainly the exceptions. We certainly weren't represented in the halls of Parliament anywhere near as much as we're represented, down Parramatta Road or in eastern Melbourne or in northern Brisbane.
As a Christian working in politics, what's that like to negotiate your religious faith in a context that I imagine is very, very secular? Like, does religion even factor into any of the policy discussions, or is it kind of seen as we just don't talk about that stuff? And I ask this because I read an interview with Michael Ware, who kind of led, I guess, Obama's efforts to engage with religious communities. And he talked about how religiously illiterate a lot of the political class were. So they were so sophisticated, so kind of like savvy and had really good kind of thinking brains when it came to policy and all that. But when it came to religion, they were completely ignorant. Would that reflect your experience? Yeah,
it's interesting. There's a broad variety of views up there in Parliament and a broad variety of people. There were actually many more people of faith than I expected in Parliament House, both members of Parliament and their staff. But it is still a very small minority. It's certainly a minority up there. What I noticed is that religious considerations, at least as a moral basis, never really found their way into policy considerations in an explicit sense. But what did reassure me as a follower of Jesus is that for a lot of people up there, their faith certainly played a role in anchoring their moral convictions from which their policy positions and policy considerations then grew. And this is what I really think it comes down to for Australia, where we really need to do better at this. The separation of church and state is one thing. That is a structural, administrative, constitutional thing, which I completely agree with. So, I'm with Thomas Jefferson on that front. But the separation of church and state does not mean for a second the separation of faith and politics. Because someone's faith is basically just what that person believes in. It's their worldview. And so to expect or assume or pressure anyone into leaving their faith at the door before they engage in public life or even in public debate is completely ridiculous. It's the equivalent of saying to the atheist or the humanist, oh, look, you can be an atheist, but when you come to Parliament, in another world, when you come to Parliament, you just have to believe in God while you're in Parliament. That's as ridiculous as it is to say to the Christian or the Muslim or the Hindu, you're fine to believe in your religion, but when you come to Parliament, you have to be secular. Now, that's not to say that I'm advocating on any level for theocracy. I think that I don't think the government should be legislating these sorts of beliefs into people's minds, but I think we need to understand that people will ground their considerations, their moral frameworks, their understandings of the world in their faith, whether they're theists or atheists of whatever variety. And we need to be able to bring those to a civic public square, a civil civic public square where both believers and non-believers can engage for the purpose of human flourishing and the furthering of Australia, regardless of what our beliefs are. And also, and this is what we do have in Australia, use that kind of open civil discourse for people to then seek truth and have the freedom to change their beliefs and change, their worldviews when they find more and more of that truth, which I believe, from the bottom of my heart to the bottom of my brain, will lead you to the person of Jesus Christ.
You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. This is Justine Toe, and I'm talking to Max Jeganathan about his experience growing up in Australia. His parents fled with him as a baby from the Sri Lankan Civil War. He grew up living between two very different cultures. If that life experience didn't already make him a global citizen, he would certainly be one now. Max was educated in the UK and is now based in Singapore, with his work frequently taking him across the Asia-Pacific. So surely this wealth of international experience, on top of his own minority experience, gives him a unique take on Australia. So I asked him, what are our hopes and our hang-ups?
I do find that Australians are an incredibly industrious and hardworking and enterprising people. And because of that, they have bought themselves bigger and bigger and bigger dreams and houses and holidays and boats and cars. We have one of the worst levels of private debt in the world. That, for me, is emblematic of a society that is looking for meaning and looking for fulfillment through material advancement and through financial security. The danger is we're actually good enough to actually accumulate financial wealth in an amazing way, and we can actually trick ourselves into thinking that it'll get us the fulfillment that we're looking for. And I believe that that's not the case. And you see that with all of the markers of human flourishing, either not moving or going backwards. So when you look at mental ill health in the country, you look at homelessness in the country, you look at anxiety and depression and suicide, all these things are not in a good place. And yet we're the wealthiest and most technologically and academically advanced that we've ever been. So there is a disconnect there.
Something weird's going on.
Yeah.
So what do you think is true fulfillment, and where would you say it can be found?
Yeah, I think the first thing to understand that we sometimes need to convince ourselves of is that the human heart does have a desire for fulfillment. We have a desire for validation, we have a desire for well-being, and we're constantly scrambling for that. If you're just growing up in Australia, you're probably more likely than anything else to just be told the way to get all of those things is to work hard, is to get money, is to buy a home, is to meet someone, is to raise a family, or some combination of those things, to retire well, to have a decent superannuation account, and so forth. And so when we limit the paradigm in which we're thinking and we limit the framework in which we're aspiring to something as simple as that, just financial security or, a solid family life or whatever it is, then necessarily our capacity for finding significance or validation or fulfillment is limited to within that paradigm. So if you limit your happiness to your family, then how well your family is going will determine exclusively how fulfilled you are or how happy you are. That could be a good thing. The problem is all of these things inside the world, inside the system, are ultimately temporary and corruptible. So it's all shifting sands in the end. And we all know that it doesn't take much to turn these things on their heads and bring them crashing down. All it takes is an affair or a health crisis or a cancer diagnosis or a tragedy in a car accident or economic recession or a change in government or a change in policy here or there, and the whole house of cards comes crumbling down very quickly. So in my view, that sense of meaning, that sense of validation, if it's going to be enduring and it's going to be holistic and it's going to transcend the vicissitudes of the world in which we live, it has to be anchored transcendentally. It has to come from somewhere beyond. Otherwise, it's always going to be subject to the rough and tumble of everyday life. And I think that's what happens, and that it's the outworking of that is the reason that we see things like anxiety and depression and social exclusion and loneliness and all these things at all-time highs. It's because we are trying to anchor our meaning to things inside this world. Sometimes they're good things, like jobs and families and money. But if we try to anchor our identity to those, we're going to be in strife. And so that's really what led me to my search for something beyond, led me to find God, to investigate the truth of Christianity, and ultimately into a relationship with Jesus Christ.
How did you become a Christian then? Can you walk us through just briefly what that was like for you?
My parents were both and are both followers of Jesus. And so I grew up very much in that environment. But I also grew up running away from it a lot too. I didn't like it. I thought it was antithetical to freedom, to my freedom to choose the life that I wanted, the things I wanted to do as I grew as well into a teenager, hormones and all of that stuff. And I thought, this is not something for me. But I always saw my parents' faith, and I saw how they lived their lives, how they related to people, and I saw that kind of inner joy and peace that they had. And I thought, well, look, there is something about this. And that led me to a place then where I actually just assumed it was a nice way to live. I actually reduced Christianity and all religion, in fact, to just ways of getting through life. And it's easy to do that. I think a lot of people do that. A lot of skeptics today, they just think that religion, it's a psychological crutch, or, as Karl Marx said, it's the opium of the people. That's just something you use to get through. I had never considered for a second that it might actually be true, that this message of Jesus might actually be literally true. And now that's the first reason I give if anyone says to me, why bother being a Christian? The only good reason to be a Christian is because it's true. And so for people who are skeptical, for people who are uncertain, for people who are angry with Christians or angry with the church for what are usually, reasonable reasons and pretty well justified reasons, my encouragement would be just investigate, open your heart and mind for a moment and just investigate the possibility that it might actually be true. I came to that decision that it was true when I was 15 years old. And in fact, even after that moment, I still struggled for a long time. And I didn't really get serious about my faith until I was probably in my early 20s. And that took a lot of investigating of the truth claims of Christianity. And I had a lot of questions around science, around freedom, around the trustworthiness of the Bible, around the character of God, around various things that Christians had been throwing around for a while that I struggled with personally. So I think it's important to follow those questions and to ask them, because if it is true, and I believe it to be true, it should be able to stand up to questioning. In fact, truth is the only thing that can stand up to questioning. So I think the only way to sensibly move forward on any of these big questions, regardless of what you believe, is to investigate the truth value of each of these claims. So I encourage people to do that. Look at the worldviews, theistic and atheistic. Test their truth value. See how they correspond to the evidence. See how they fit with what the world is like, what the evidence base looks like. And my view is, if you do that honestly, as Plato said, you'll find truth if you follow the evidence to where it leads. If you follow it to where it leads, it'll lead you to the person of Jesus Christ. That's my very firm belief and conviction. And so I've been a Christian now for 20 years.
And on top of what you call as the truth, I guess you've also found a profound sense of belonging that also goes back to the validation as well.
I think that's absolutely right. So I talked about tribes earlier, that we find our belonging, that desire to find our belonging often ends in us finding our tribes. And I think that's a good thing. But once again, those tribes are kind of temporary and malleable. They can break down at any moment just because of human brokenness and human imperfection. And so when you find your belonging in the person of Jesus, when you find it in something transcendent that's still so real and evidence-based, then you're it's not like you're invincible to what the world has, but your identity is invincible in a very literal sense. So there's nothing really the world can throw at you that can shake who you are in Jesus as a child of God, as a member of his family. Rough things will still happen. And so it never says anywhere in the Bible that the Christian life is easy or free of suffering or anything like that. But it does say that it's guaranteed to be quite an incredible ride, full of joy and peace and ups and downs. And the fact that you're doing it hand in hand with your Creator, I think, is the most important thing.
From the Centre for Public Christianity, you've been listening to Life and Faith with Justine Toe. The talk on finding validation that Max was in Sydney to give can be found at theedge.live. Do check it out. And if you know someone who might enjoy this conversation with Max, please share it with them. You can find it on our website, publicchristianity.org, or on your podcast app. Just type Life and Faith in the search box to find us. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating or review. It helps us to know what you think of the show and helps other people find it too. Next week.
There was one guy who had no contact with Rod, left school, was not a strong student, I think actually didn't even make it all the way through school. In his early 30s, he contracts a serious cancer and he's terminally ill. And the one person he asks to come and see him and then to conduct his funeral is Rod West. And Rod thinks, well, this is strange because I haven't seen this guy since school days. And he says to Rod when Rod comes in, you're the person who understands me and understood me and understands me more than anyone else. You've been a profound influence on my life and I want you to take my funeral. And that's the nature of the connection that he had with students was that people, and of course the families and parents and so forth, was that they sensed this direct connection, this personal connection, and he had this capacity, this largeness of spirit that so many people could be encompassed in that.